My concern with Elon Musk, though, is that there is, by any account, the world's richest man, or certainly one of the richest men in the world, that is using his weight to buy elections. And that can't be good for democracy.
Humza, thank you so much for joining us and for your comments just now, particularly your comments about staying true to yourself. It really does resonate after last week's debate. I wanted to start by asking you about your time in politics. You talked about how you were the first Muslim man to become a leader of a Western democracy, and you also talked about the Islamophobia that has now poisoned politics. Could you speak more about your experience and the kind of prejudice that you felt you faced throughout your time rising up the ranks of Scottish politics?
Well, do you know what? Thank you again for the invitation. Thank you to all for your indulgence so far, and I look forward to engaging with you all as we go on. So when it comes to Islamophobia, there was a time when it was a bit more subtle, when the comments would be what you might describe slightly below the radar. They were not in the mainstream of political discourse. That has completely changed. I referenced there the dog whistle that Nigel Farage blew at the beginning of the general election campaign. Of course, this is a man who has form. He described Muslims, and by the way, the code word for Muslims is migrants, because by the way, they don't mean a certain type of migrant. There's a particular type of migrant that they often mean. That he said they were coming here, they were coming here as a fifth column to kill us all. So this is a man who has form in anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia, and is not just elected as an MP. By most predictions, and a lot can change in politics, most people think that he will gain in popularity. His party will gain members of parliament, and I suspect that will be true in the Scottish Parliament. And I mentioned France, Germany, and the Netherlands. So if I just take those countries, France, their candidate for Prime Minister, and thankfully defeated, Jordan Bardella, was a man that associated himself with an anti-Muslim group who used to hold pork and wine parties in Muslim neighbourhoods. And there's nobody here, I suspect, that's willing to put a bet that Marine Le Pen won't win a future presidential election. I mentioned the AfD in Germany. The AfD in Germany dedicated an entire chapter in their manifesto a number of years now ago that said Islam doesn't belong to Germany. And the Freedom Party, the Party of Freedom in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders' party, well, my goodness, you could, and when it comes to a whole plethora of anti-Muslim figures, he is the Islamophobe in chief. So you have gone from a position where, yes, I've faced Islamophobia, whether it's on social media, whether it's other elected members asking me if I'm hiding behind my burqa, whether it's threats that have been made to me because of my faith. You've gone where it's now so open and on the rise that every Muslim I talk to, and I think there's probably a number in the crowd here, so they can feel free to challenge me, but virtually every Muslim I talk to questions whether or not this country, Europe, and more generally the West, will be safe for them or their families growing up.
Thank you very much, Humza. I want to move on to talk about your time as First Minister. After you resigned, Kate Forbes, who's now the Deputy First Minister, said that the SNP had to go back to the mainstream and that it had to restore candid and competent government. Do you think she was right that the SNP had moved away from the mainstream?
So look, I wouldn't agree that, and Kate, she and I were political rivals during the election contest, but I think she had made a mistake during the election contest and therefore was punished as such for trashing the kind of record of our government over the period that we've been in power. That doesn't mean, by the way, we haven't made mistakes. I'll be the very first to admit that there are some matters that have been of deep, deep regret and that we should have handled far better. So there's no doubting that when you've been in power for as long as we have, 17 years. But at the same time, when it comes to the mainstream, I suppose this was the point that I wanted to make around populism, but also the point that you can either be led or you can lead. So if I go back to that issue of immigration for just a moment. In Scotland, in a recent survey, this survey of the public, views on the issue of immigration have increased in their positivity in Scotland. Very stark to the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, there's lots of competing theories about why that's the case. But if you want my theory, for what it's worth, in the 25 years that we've had devolution, the Scottish Parliament, whatever political party has been in the government, Liberal Democrat, Labour coalition, Labour, the SNP, there has been a general consensus, even amongst, I have to say, the Scottish Conservatives, that migration has been good for Scotland, and we need it in Scotland. Our population is under real threat in terms of population decline in the future. We have an ageing population, and therefore migration is absolutely crucial. So if you decide to lead, and you decide to take that role on, you can help to move the public discourse in a certain direction. So I suppose in short, I'm really proud of the fact that we've stood up for very progressive values. We've tried to lead as a government. And I think that's something that you should do in government. You shouldn't just be led, you should lead.
Thank you. So just following up on your point about mistakes you think you've made, in regard to the Boot House agreement, what would you have done differently? Do you think the issue was you entering the agreement in the first place? Just for the benefit of the audience, the Boot House agreement relates to the power sharing agreement with the Scottish Greens and the SNP. Do you think you shouldn't have gone to the agreement in the first place, or was it the fact that you announced it in that way?
No. So I was a big supporter of the Boot House agreement. So again, Boot House agreement between the SNP and the Greens, which helped us, I think in a very toxic political environment to have a majority, a partnership with the Greens that allowed us to pass most issues. But there comes a point in any partnership where the strain gets too much. And again, I won't go into all the history here, but the context of that moment that led eventually to my resignation, we had the Boot House agreement being put to the Green membership. All the intelligence that we were receiving was the Green members were going to reject it. And already a lot of commentary around the junior partner, the Greens, the green tail wagging the dog. My own party, even the most ardent supporters of the Boot House agreement, after a particularly disastrous interview, I think, by the leader of the Greens, which went against collective responsibility, my phone was off the hook with the ardent supporters of the Boot House agreement saying, it's got to end. So I think it had to end. Could I have done it differently? I think the obvious answer is yes. Would that have changed the outcome altogether? It might have delayed it. I think if I had sat down with Patrick Harvey, who's co-leader of the Green Party, and Lorna Slater, the other co-leader, if I'd sat down with them and said, look, we need to do a kind of Gwyneth Paltrow, Chris Martin, and consciously uncouple, take our time, just drift apart. Let's do it over a few weeks. Let's do it through candid conversation, respect for each other. I still think they probably would have said, that's not what we want. And if you're doing that to us, then there'll be a motion of no confidence. And we kind of tallied up the numbers, and there was still a route through, even if they voted against us. But ultimately, again, other factors conspired. I think Alex Salmond, at the time, overplayed his hand on that issue, and that ultimately made an agreement with Alba impossible as well. So I've always believed, and I suppose sticking to the theme of imparting advice, we all make mistakes. I've met presidents, prime ministers, kings and queens, and to a man and a woman, they all make mistakes. And you throughout your life will make mistakes. My best advice I can give you is own those mistakes, but also don't let them define you. As I say, there's not a single person on this earth that hasn't made a mistake in their career or in their life. And I think it's really important that you don't let that define you, but say, you know what, the honourable thing to do, and we could do more of this, I think, in politics, the most honourable thing you can do is own up to it and decide to take whatever action you think is necessary to rectify it.
Absolutely. I want to ask about independence. When you were First Minister, you wrote the fourth Building a New Scotland paper about independence, and you said that an independent Scotland should have a written constitution. My first question is, given that you've requested Rishi Sunak to, under Chapter 30, put a referendum to the Scottish people, and that was rejected by Westminster, how do you think the path forward with independence would look like?
So, when I was doing a wonderful tour, my thanks to Mina, I think it was, giving a wonderful tour to us earlier on, she took me into the actual library, not the Goodman Library, but the actual library where you can take out a few books. And I was met by a wonderful chap who said, "It's lovely to see you. I'm a die-hard unionist," was his introduction. To which I said, "Look, every sinner can repent," but that is just the way of things. So, that is a joke, obviously. So I found it very interesting, though, that was the way that his introduction to me was, and it was fine by way of introduction. But I suppose it does speak to a challenge in Scotland, which I think is becoming slightly easier now, but people will define themselves by the constitutional question, and have often voted along constitutional lines. Now, I think that has probably diluted in the recent general election, because clearly all those who supported independence didn't vote for the SNP, otherwise we'd have far more seats than we currently hold. So you have this slightly different relationship around the Constitution from the Scottish public. The long and short of your question is that there still continues to be an impasse. So you have a very legitimate argument, I would suggest, from the Scottish Parliament and government, which says that the majority of the Scottish Parliament has elected pro-independence members of that Parliament. So parliamentarians make up a majority in our nation's Parliament that want another referendum. So you've got a democratic mandate to have another referendum. You then have, on the other side, again, it's an argument that has some logic, that is from Keir Starmer. It says, well, I have a massive mandate, including in Scotland, and I'm very vehemently opposed to a referendum. So you've got an impasse, and there has to be a serious discussion around how the democratic voice in Scotland is given effect. It must be through a democratic route. There's nobody serious that suggests there should be a UDI or a wildcat referendum. There's nobody serious that suggests that in Scotland. So there has to be, and maybe the way around this, again, to get to the answer to your question, and I've advocated or suggested that maybe this is where we need international mediation. We've had international mediators in other areas of tension and impasse between two governments. There is an impasse between the two governments. There's got to be a diplomatic way to find a resolution.
Also on the point of the written constitution, if Scotland is to be independent, is it your view that the head of state should remain as King Charles, or will the Scottish people have the opportunity to choose who their head of state would be?
When Scotland becomes independent.
I'll leave that one to you.
There should be that should be something in the written constitution. Look, my perspective, and this is not a surprise because I've been very public. I'm a Republican. I believe that you shouldn't become head of state due to your birthright. I think I'm a citizen, not a subject. And I've been upfront about that. I've never hidden it or pretended otherwise. Do I think it's the most important issue to deal with when you first become independent? Probably not. I think each party should stand on what its manifesto is for an independent Scotland. The SNP's position may well be that the current king, King Charles, remains king until such time the Scottish people no longer want the monarchy as their head of state. So, look, ultimately it'll be for the Scottish people to decide. But I mentioned they're standing up to the kind of having the courage of your convictions. I'm not one to hide or pretend I'm anything other than what I am. And so for me, I would prefer Scotland in the future to be an independent republic.
Thank you very much. I want to move on to audience questions, but before I do that, I want to ask you about the American election. You've had a very public beef with Elon Musk. You've called him a race baiter and one of the most dangerous people in the world. He obviously owns X and has a lot of influence and is credited with much regarding the last election. What do you think should be done to handle platforms like X and Facebook? And do you think the government should interfere in policing what goes on in these platforms?
Yeah, so there has to be a level of regulation on these platforms that just simply doesn't exist.
Yep.
I mean, the level of death threat, rape threats towards my wife, threats towards my children that come to me, I was going to say behind anonymised accounts, some of them are not anonymised and people have been charged as a result of that, but are spewed with impunity. And I say impunity because they'll get reported and nothing will happen to them and they're within community guidelines or whatever. So there has to be some level of regulation, and better than what we have at the moment. My concern with Elon Musk, though, is that there is, by any account, the world's richest man, or certainly one of the richest men in the world, that is using his weight to buy elections. And that can't be good for democracy. There is, of course, we know how much he's donated, or certainly we have a rough idea of the quantum that he's donated to help to get Donald Trump elected. There's now talk in the press, has it been reported, that he's willing to give Nigel Farage and the Reform Party £100 million as a donation. So we have an American billionaire looking to try to buy an election here in the UK. And he is completely unaccountable. Completely unaccountable. Okay, maybe accountable to some shareholders, but he's not accountable to the electorate here in the United Kingdom. And therefore, to me, he's one of the most dangerous men who uses his platform and his wealth to amplify the most toxic, far-right, white supremacist ideology that I think I've seen in my lifetime. And if he thinks his billions can kind of silence me or intimidate me, then he's definitely got the wrong impression. So I'll continue to call it out, I'll continue to speak up against it. But I think we've got a real problem with people like Elon Musk using their billions to try to interfere in elections.
Thank you very much, Humza.